I can tell you what killed the flavor in your last fish without ever seeing the water you pulled it from. Not the species, not the lake. The way the meat sits on the board when the skin comes off, the color near the spine, the way it flakes or tears, it reads like a receipt. It tells me almost everything that happened in the first hour after you set the hook. And most of the time, that fish was already ruined long before it ever touched your cooler. You spent the money on the cooler, $300, maybe more, for a box with a name molded into the lid. I am not going to stand here and tell you it does not hold ice. It does. But a cooler is the last link in a chain, and by the time your catch reaches it, the damage that turns a clean fillet into something flat and gray is usually already done. Here is the part nobody at the tackle counter has any reason to say out loud. The things that actually save a fish: a sharp blade in the first 30 minutes, the right mix of ice and water, the way you carry it home. None of them can be patented. None of them can be bottled and sold back to you every spring in a fresh package. There is no peg on the wall for doing it in the right order. So the industry sells you the box, the thing with a barcode, and stays quiet about the rest. Meanwhile, 2 aisles over at a warehouse store you already walk through every week, 10 unremarkable things sit on a shelf, and any one of them will do more for the taste of your catch than the most expensive cooler ever made. 10 of them, counting down, and the last 2 are the ones that quietly undo more good fish than every mistake on the water combined. Let us start where the fish does. On the water, with a clock you probably did not know was running. The moment a fish comes over the rail, a clock starts. For the first half hour, you have more control over how that fish is going to taste than you will at any other point, including the kitchen. And almost nobody uses it, because nobody ever told them it was there. Number 10 on the shelf is the plainest thing on this list. A sharp fillet knife, not a signature pro angler blade behind glass at the tackle shop for $60, the 3-pack of high-carbon kitchen knives at the warehouse store, or a single good chef's knife for the price of 2 crankbaits. Here is why it earns the spot. When you bleed a fish, you cut the gill arches so the heart pumps the blood out of the muscle while it still can. Researchers at NOFEMA, a food science institute that works with the commercial whitefish industry, found that the single most important factor in how clean a fillet turns out is not the method. It is the time. Cod bled within 30 minutes came out visibly whiter, with less blood left in the meat. Wait too long, and the blood settles into the flesh, and no amount of rinsing gets it back out. Here is why that half hour is the whole ball game. The instant a fish dies, its own enzymes and the bacteria it carries begin breaking the flesh down from the inside, and that only speeds up while the body sits warm. Bleeding and chilling in that first window is you stepping in before the fish starts to digest itself. Miss it on the water, and there is nothing a knife or a freezer can do later to give it back. A dull knife wrecks this. It tears instead of slices. The cut closes, the fish does not drain, and you have lost the window. Think of blood left in the muscle the way you would think of a bruise spreading through an apple. It is the first place the taste goes off. The blade is the cheapest insurance on this entire list. Now, a caution before you cut. A lot of states have rules about filleting or skinning a fish before you are off the water, because a warden has to be able to check the size and the limit. So this is about the bleed, a cut to the gills, not dressing the whole fish at the ramp. Check your state regulations before you do anything permanent to that fish on the water. Number 9 is what you drop the fish into next. And here I am going to tell you something that runs straight against advice you have heard your whole life. You have been told to drain the water out of your cooler. Keep it dry, they say. For keeping fish, that advice is backward. Number 9 is a soft-sided insulated tote, the kind that shows up at the warehouse store for the price of lunch. You fill it with a slurry, roughly 2 parts ice to 1 part water. Not ice alone, ice and water, together, stirred into a slush. Here is the physics, and it is the part the cooler box will never explain. Dry ice touches a fish in a few hard points, and air fills the gaps, and air is a terrible carrier of heat. Add water, and the slush wraps every surface of the fish at once, because water moves heat far better than air does. The United Nations Handbook on Fish Handling says it plainly: the fastest practical way to chill a fish is a slurry of ice and water. Picture cooling a hot pan by blowing on it, versus setting it in a sink of cold water. Same fish. A completely different clock. And this is not only a boat trick. A bank fisherman with a soft tote, a bag of ice, and a bottle of water can build the same slush on the tailgate. A kayak angler can run a small one between the knees. The fish does not care how you got out there. It only counts the minutes and the degrees. That slush pulls a fish down toward 32 degrees Fahrenheit in minutes instead of hours. And if you cannot get ice on it right away, at the very least keep it out of the sun and keep it wet, because a dry fish in warm air is a fish spoiling in fast forward. Those first minutes are worth days on the back end. Which brings us to the thing you are wearing while you handle all of this. Number 8 costs almost nothing and buys you something you cannot taste until it is too late. A box of nitrile gloves, the bulk box off the warehouse shelf, the same ones a fish house buys by the case. When you bleed and gut a fish, your hands are the busiest tool you have. Every fish that comes off the water is already carrying bacteria from its own gut and gills. That is normal. The problem is dragging it into the clean meat, or introducing whatever is on your hands and your boat into the cut. Fresh fish spoil faster than beef for a simple reason. The bacteria they carry are already built for cold water, so they do not slow down in the chill the way land animal bacteria do. Keeping the cut clean is how you keep that clock from speeding up. Gloves are not about looking like a surgeon. They are about not seasoning your dinner with the boat. Nobody sells you a fillet ruined by a dirty thumb, so nobody warns you about it. And notice the pattern already. A knife, a bag of slush, a box of gloves. Not one of them has a fishing brand on it. Not one of them is marked up because it sat in the tackle aisle instead of the kitchen aisle. That is the whole game. The tools that save a fish live everywhere except the store that is supposed to sell you fishing. So far, everything has happened within arm's reach of the water. Here is where most good fish actually die. The moment you turn your back on them and start the truck. The drive home is the part of the trip nobody guards. You have a cooler in the bed of the truck, the sun is up, it is a 2-hour ride, and you figure the fish are fine. They were fine when you left the ramp. Here is the number that should change your mind. In commercial seafood handling, a delay of just a few hours in getting a fish down near freezing can cut days off how long it stays good. Because the moment the temperature climbs above the melting point of ice, bacteria start multiplying, and their speed roughly doubles for even a small rise in temperature. Warm a fish from just below freezing to a few degrees above it, and you have doubled the rate it is spoiling. On a hot tailgate, in a dark truck bed, that climb happens fast. A cooler that started at 32 degrees at the ramp can be well on its way to 40 by the time you hit the driveway, and the whole time, the clock is running against you. Picture a striper you caught at first light, riding home under a July sun. 2 hours in a slowly warming box is 2 hours of that fish quietly turning, and you will taste it at dinner on Thursday whether you ever learn why or not. Number 7 is a deep cycle marine battery, the kind the warehouse club sells under an everyday name for a fraction of what a marine electronics counter charges for the same chemistry. Same lead, same acid, same job. It is the quiet power source that lets you run the two things that keep a fish cold once you leave the water. Number 6 is one of them, and it is the sleeper of this entire list. A 12-volt portable fridge, or a portable power station to run one. Warehouse clubs have carried these for years, aimed at campers, and almost no angler ever thinks to point one at a cooler of fish. Plug it in, set it near 32 degrees, and the drive home stops being the weak link. Your catch rides home at the same temperature it left the water, instead of slowly warming under a lid that only slows the heat down and never stops it. Because that is the real trap in spending $300 on a box. A box, no matter whose name is on the lid, can only slow the warming down. It cannot make a fish colder. The best cooler on earth is still just running out the clock, and the drive home is often long enough to run it out. A cooler is a delay. A fridge is a decision. Before we walk into the kitchen, where I have watched more good fish get wrecked than anywhere else, I want to put something in your hands. Everything on this list, the order it happens in, the slurry ratio, the temperatures, and the sources so you can check every claim yourself, I have gathered onto a single page. One sheet you can tape inside the lid of whatever cooler you already own, or pin up in the garage next to the cleaning table. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the next handful of things on this shelf undo more good fish than everything on the water combined, and one of them is probably in your kitchen right now, quietly working against you. Number 5 is a cutting board. Not one board, the pack of heavy plastic boards the warehouse store sells for the price of a bag of soft plastics. Here is why more than one matters. Wood looks beautiful and holds knife scars, and those scars hold bacteria. A hard plastic board scrubs clean and goes in the dishwasher. Keep one for fish and nothing else, and you have closed a door that a lot of home cooks leave standing wide open. Pair it with a proper boning or fillet knife from that same kitchen aisle. Thin, flexible, sharp, and you will take cleaner fillets with less waste than you ever did wrestling a stiff blade at the dock. Number 4 is a bag of coarse kosher salt. Before a fillet ever goes into the freezer, a short soak in a light saltwater brine firms the flesh and pulls out some of the water that would otherwise tear the cells when it freezes into jagged crystals. It is the difference between a fillet that thaws firm and one that thaws to mush. A whole box of it costs less than a single branded fish brine packet from the tackle shop, which is mostly salt anyway. 10 minutes in cold, lightly salted water is plenty for most fillets. You are not curing it, you are giving the cells a head start before the deep cold hits. Number 3 is the least glamorous thing here, and it quietly ties the whole system together. A kitchen scale. It is how you actually hit that 2 parts ice to 1 part water slurry, instead of eyeballing it. And it is how you portion fillets, so a family of 4 thaws exactly what it eats and refreezes nothing, because every time a fish thaws and refreezes, it loses another round of moisture and firmness, and you can taste every round. A $5 scale making a $50 difference. That is the pattern this whole channel is built on. Which leaves the last 2. The 2 that live in the coldest part of your house, and account for more ruined fish than every mistake we have covered so far. Here is a thing most anglers never connect. The fish you lose to the freezer, you lose slowly, over weeks, so you never catch it happening. You just pull out a fillet 3 months later, and it is dry, gray at the edges, and it tastes like cardboard. You blame the fish. It was not the fish. That is freezer burn, and it is not your freezer being too cold. It is your freezer being too dry. Cold air in a freezer is thirsty. It pulls moisture straight out of the surface of any exposed fish. The ice on the fillet turns to vapor without ever melting, the same way a snowbank shrinks on a dry, freezing day without a single drop of runoff. Where the moisture leaves, it opens tiny pits, air gets down into them, and the fats begin to turn. On oily fish like trout and salmon, that rancid edge sets in fastest of all. Number 2 is what stops it cold. A vacuum sealer. The warehouse clubs keep the units, and the bag rolls on the shelf year-round. And here is the comparison that matters. Fish wrapped in paper or a zip bag is good for a few weeks before the dry air finds it. Fish with the air pulled out and the bag sealed tight holds its quality for 12 to 24 months. That is not a small upgrade. That is the difference between eating last spring's walleye in December and throwing it in the trash. But here is the part the box will never print, and it is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to tell you. When you pull the air out around raw fish, you do not just stop freezer burn. You create the one thing a rare and dangerous bacteria wants: no oxygen. The food safety guidance from the FDA is clear. Vacuum-sealed raw fish has to be kept frozen or held below 38 degrees Fahrenheit and used quickly, and you open the bag before you thaw it to let the air back in. This particular bacteria does not announce itself with a smell, so a fish can be dangerous while looking and smelling perfectly fine. The rule is simple, and it is not optional. Seal it, freeze it, and open it before it thaws. Do that, and vacuum sealing is the single best thing you can do for your catch. Skip it, and a tool that saves fish can put you in the hospital. Which brings us to number 1, the thing that makes everything else last. A chest freezer. A standalone deep freezer, the kind warehouse clubs sell for a couple $100s, and it beats the freezer sitting on top of your kitchen fridge for one reason: temperature, and how steady it holds it. Fish stored at 0 degrees Fahrenheit keeps for months. But the commercial data is striking. Drop the temperature to 40 below, and a fatty fish that would hold its peak quality for 4 to 6 months in a normal freezer holds it for well over a year. Cold is time. The colder and the steadier, the longer your season lasts. And a chest freezer opens from the top, so the cold air, which sinks, stays inside every time you lift the lid, instead of spilling out the front the way it does on an upright. It is the difference between a bucket and an open drawer. One more habit that costs nothing. Write the species and the date on every bag before it goes in, and always pull from the oldest first. A freezer is only as good as your memory of what is inside it, and a fillet you forget for 2 years is a fillet you throw out no matter how well you sealed it. It was to eat every one of them at its best. 10 things: a knife, a slurry, a box of gloves, a battery, a fridge, a board, salt, a scale, a sealer, and a freezer. Add all 10 together and you have spent less than one premium cooler. And you have done more for your catch than that cooler ever could. Go back to the fish on my board from the opening, the one I said I could read like a receipt. Now you know what I am actually reading. Not the lake, the chain. Was it bled in the first 30 minutes? Did it ride in a slurry or on dry ice in the sun? Did the drive home hold the line or let it slip? Did it go into the freezer sealed and cold or open and slow? Every one of those is a choice, and not one of them costs what a cooler costs. Here is what I want you to sit with. None of these 10 things is a secret. They are on a shelf you already walk past. The reason no one connected them for you is not a conspiracy. It is simpler and colder than that. There is no money in it. You cannot patent a slurry ratio. You cannot put bleed it in 30 minutes in a package and sell it again next spring. The whole chain that actually saves a fish is built out of ordinary things from the wrong aisle, and knowledge with no barcode at all. So the market sells you the one thing it can stamp a logo on, the box, and lets the rest stay quiet. And notice what that does to the way you shop. Once you have seen the chain, a wall of $300 coolers stops looking like a wall of performance and starts looking like a wall of lids. Nice lids, tough lids, but lids. The performance was never in the box. It was in the 10 quiet things nobody ever put a spotlight on. You are not in that quiet anymore. You know the chain now, start to finish. The next fish you land, you will feel the clock start, and you will know exactly what to do with it. If you would rather fish knowing what the aisle will not tell you, you already know which side of this you are on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of it back into the light. One honest thing at a time.